Professor Simpson, thank you so much. Great to see you. Did you serve in the city council with Ed Burke? You must have some long memories of what it was like, what he was like even as a younger alderman.
Yes, I was in the council from 71 to 79. Ed Burke came in 69 in a special election. And so we served together. He was very different in the early period of the city council. He was part of what was called the Coffee Rebellion, or what some people call the Young Turks. He was part of the machine, and he voted with Daley consistently, 100%. But he had doubts, and he would listen to the arguments by the liberals and the reformers.
What happened? What happened? I mean, here's a guy, I mean, if you looked at his trajectory, he came with the police background, his father. There's many things you could point to, but what do you think what happened to him?
Well, one answer is he stayed too long. Generally, people get more autocratic and less listening to others and take themselves too seriously the longer they're in power. You could see it with Richard J. Daley, you could see it with Richard M. Daley, and you see it with Mike Madigan, and you see it with Eddie Burke.
And that sort of what people now have referred to as the Chicago way. Does it just sort of seep into your system? I mean, how does that happen that you have this ability to say, oh, I will direct business to my company so that then in the council I'll give them a break? How does that come about?
Well, it is a kind of concept that comes from machine politics, and if you're in the machine a long time, you have that mindset. Citizens think they have to bribe public officials to get regular city services. Public officials think they should be bribed. When you get that confluence, it's a real problem, and it starts with patronage. And Eddie Burke has been deeply involved in patronage from when he was a boy. And it then follows through with doing favors for people in return for votes. And finally, to the level of contracts for companies that give you campaign contributions, or in Eddie Burke's case, or Michael Madigan's, where they actually get money through the law firm to pay them off. So Burke became a millionaire. His campaign war chest before this period, when he's had to pay for lawyers, has been at $12 million for an alderman.
Amazing. And as the finance chair, he was king of the hill.
He was. He became first powerful under Jane Byrne. Jane Byrne came in as a supposed reformer, but when the reformers offered to get her a majority and to do the reforms, she turned to Burke and Verdoliak. And so Burke began then. He then headed the bloc against Harold Washington in the council wars period, and has been finance chairman for most of the mayors since, except Lori Lightfoot.
So, fast forward to the feds come knocking at his door, which that was like a day the earth stood still in Chicago. It seemed as if no one could believe it. Not just at his home, but at his offices, the city council. It took a mole. It took another alderman. What about that?
Yeah, they needed to have him saying in his own words the items of corruption, because most of what he does is, he's so powerful, he's going before the Zoning Board of Appeals to get property tax reductions in the hundreds of millions of dollars, including for Trump. That kind of thing is on the edge, but it's not really corruption. If he does favors for big corporations and gets some property tax reductions because of his clout. But what came out on the tapes was clear bribery and shaking down people. The Burger King in his ward, the people who were trying to redevelop the post office, and some other developers throughout the city.
What about that Burger King? It seems like a simple sort of a throwaway, and yet that was one of the cases that ends up perhaps taking down Ed Burke.
Yeah, it was one of the problems of aldermanic prerogative gone amok, particularly with Ed Burke's case. An alderman shouldn't be able to just pick up the phone and stop a driveway until they agreed to have his law firm represent them. That's just straight out shakedown. It's like the mafia coming to your door and doing it. And that shouldn't have happened. That just wasn't And that's why Lori Lightfoot's passing the executive order, first day in office, eliminating aldermanic prerogative, is so very important.
He was known to be the guy, if you wanted to be a judge in Chicago, you had to see Ed Burke.
Ed Burke headed the slating committee of the Central Committee of the Democrats of Cook County, which meant that if you were going to be a judge and get the Democratic Party endorsement, you had to have the blessing from Ed Burke.
What did that mean? What did it take to get the blessing of Ed Burke?
Well, Ed Burke had a broader idea than just simple payoffs. So he could get someone appointed judge or help them get elected judge just because he wanted to be in favor with them, because he wanted to do them a favor. Ed Burke had a whole sort of generous side. I'll tell you a couple of stories. So when I ran for Congress against Dan Rostenkowski, I lost. No one else sent me a note, but Ed Burke sent me a note saying, I understand what it's like to lose an election. I know you ran a good campaign. There was no payoff for that. That was simply an outreach. Ed Burke used to give out various kinds of gifts. For instance, when he came to my class, he would often give me his latest book, or he might give me, when we're aldermen, we have a badge that makes us the equivalent of a police captain. Now, it's only honorary. If you actually try to arrest someone without it, you're not going to be in big trouble. But Ed Burke had a whole bunch of those made up, not only for former aldermen, but for people that he wanted to give the symbolic gift to.
Ah, yeah, interesting. But Danny Solis, again, back to him. How, here, maybe he didn't think he was doing anything wrong, so why would he be careful in who he spoke to? Or did he slip up?
He mostly slipped up. He shouldn't have done it. And secondly, if he did it, he shouldn't tell anyone he's doing it. But aldermen are hail fellows, well met. They're genial, even if they're on opposite sides. Out in the front in the council chambers proper, they may be yelling at each other, but back behind the scenes, they're slapping each other on the back and telling jokes and having a good time. They have a Christmas party every year with the mayor and things like that. It's a different attitude, and so we felt comfortable with Solis. He knew that Solis was on the take as head of the zoning board, the zoning committee of the city council, and so talking zoning deals and getting some law business seemed like a natural thing.
Danny Solis, he's trying to save his own skin too, isn't he?
Oh yeah, Danny Solis was caught up in a whole bunch of very bad things. He was going to massage parlors, he was getting Viagra, all free. He was caught in a variety of sort of petty crimes, not really the big zoning crimes as much as Burke was, but essentially the Fed said to him, let's make a deal. If you testify against Burke and Madigan, and you wear a wire and help us get the information, we will let you do without jail time.
And not just wear a wire for a week or two.
This was a 2-year project, yes. So there were plenty of useless conversations in the 2 years, that aren't part of this trial. Fortunately, we don't have to listen to 2 years of tape.
Yeah, but without Danny Solis, what do the feds have?
Well, they have a lot of circumstantial evidence. But too many of the deals are sort of covered up as going through the law office that aren't obviously corruption in the narrow sense that the Supreme Court demands now. The Supreme Court says it isn't corruption unless I give you a bribe for a specific governmental action you're going to do. And Burke was pretty careful not to do that. He recused himself from voting on the floor of the city council more times than any alderman in the history of Chicago.
Because?
Because that was partial protection. If he had voted, let's say he took, had a law client with American Airlines and was doing property tax, but they also happened to have runways at O'Hare Field. And so one of the O'Hare bills is coming before the city council. If Burke had voted and shown that he was was guiding this legislation through the city council, he would have been clearly convicted of corruption a long time ago.
So, do indictments matter? He's number 37 since 1969?
There's been 37 since then, not counting people like Solis that are yet to get sentenced. So yes, convicting an alderman is not enough to prevent corruption.
And yet, this trial is one a lot of people are watching.
It is, because it's between this and the Madigan trial, you have the trial of the slick old-time bosses. Burke is ward committeeman and alderman of the 14th Ward, or was, and Mike Madigan was the powerful member who headed the General Assembly more time than any other speaker in the United States of any assembly of government. That's a big deal. And so if they both go down for corruption, people are going to think about, well, even if we're clever lawyers and we pass the money through our law firm or whatever, we're probably going to get caught eventually.
Term limits might be a good idea for these guys to consider.
Term limits are always an excellent idea. The only argument gets to be, should it be 12 years or 8 years? Should we have term limits? Absolutely.
Yeah, he stayed too long.
He stayed too long. I don't know when the corruption started. Probably not the first term that he was alderman, probably much later.
I think that, someone who doesn't know Ed Burke and isn't as clued in as we are, when you hear that a fellow colleague, a fellow coworker in a sense, wore a wire to take you down when you were probably giving out some award, some prizes in a way to him, definitely directing business and whatever. It's really like old time, crazy, corrupt politics that you can't believe still exists.
Yes, well, you have to remember, Chicago is the most corrupt metropolitan region in the country, and Illinois is the third most corrupt state. In Illinois, there have been more than 2,100 convictions of public officials for corruption since 1976. More than 1,800 of those have been in the metropolitan region. You'll
be watching Ed Burke closely.
Yes. I was almost scheduled to be giving expert witness testimony in the trial, but I was going to be out of town, so I couldn't.
He had this aura around him.
So, most importantly, because Alderman Burke was the head of the Finance Committee, you have to understand that 80 to 90% of the important legislation in the City Council goes through the Finance Committee. You can't pave a street unless you pay for it. You can't get $100 million from the federal government unless you submit a grant. On and on. Most of the budget of the city of Chicago originally was controlled through the Finance Committee, which he had an immense amount of power. In addition, he had the largest staff. His staff was larger than all of the other staff of the city council, and he controlled things like workman's comp. If you got hurt as a city employee, you had to go to Ed Burke and his committee to get compensation.
The Dailies escaped any kind of indictment, anything. However, the nephew, it just seemed as if when Rich left, that people were like, he's leaving now because he's about 10 steps away from maybe something like this happening. I mean, it just that period of time of Burke and Daley and now Madigan, it was just a kind of, I've got mine, you get yours, I'm gonna amass this power.
Well, one of the differences between the Daleys and Burke and Madigan was what his finance chairman, Tom Keene, said. He said, Daley wanted power, I wanted money, and we both got what we wanted. Of course, he went to prison.
Wow. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Well, how do you think Ed Burke, as this trial begins, leading up to days away, how's he preparing himself?
Well, nearly everyone who goes to trial thinks they're innocent. And I'm certain that Ed Burke thinks that he did not break the law in any form. He probably doesn't contest that there were conflicts of interest, but he's pretty confident he didn't break the law. That's simply the way people see themselves. I think you'll find him, as he goes into court, as dapper as when he went into the city council. He'll be wearing his pinstripe suit and a tie and a handkerchief in his pocket. He will be well spoken. He won't. He will probably be pretty reticent. He hasn't done press interviews for 30 years, so I don't think he'll be having big press conferences other than to say that he's not guilty.
Could you imagine him taking the stand?
I don't think they're going to let him take the stand because that involves an additional set of charges about perjury. And so if he were to say, I didn't say such and such, and they play the tape and he said it, even if he wasn't guilty of everything else, he'd be guilty of perjury. So it's a very dangerous thing to take the stand in this circumstance.
Can you compare it? I mean, we certainly have seen big trials, Blagojevich and George Ryan, but this one's different.
Yeah, it may well be the end of an era. That the Mike Madigans and the Eddie Burkes are not likely to come again.
Is that a good thing for Chicago?
It's time for Chicago to move on. It's time for us to actually practice democracy, not just say we like democracy. And it's time for us to, as Harold Washington said, make sure the machine is dead, dead, dead.
And also, Lightfoot, don't you believe her win was really tied somewhat to his indictment?
Yes, she won the election in 2019 because she came out against Ed Burke. I was part of her campaign advisory group, and we immediately saw that this was a great advantage, and she took every opportunity to make it clear that she was not Ed Burke and to attack then Tony Preckwinkle for taking campaign money from Ed Burke.
Anyone that had any ties, Susanna Mendoza, his wife did the wedding, it was this whole, like they were pariahs, stay away from the Burkes. Yeah. Why does it take so long?
Things are very slow in a lot of politics. For instance, Paul Douglas once noticed that the bridges don't really need to be manned during the winter, and you didn't need to have them manned by 6 people, 24 hours, 2 people each shift for 24 hours a day, particularly in the winter. And so he made a simple suggestion. Why don't the bridge tenders open one bridge, get in their car and go drive 2 bridges down and open the next one? And that simple proposal to save 1/3 of the budget that we spend on bridge tenders didn't get enacted until Harold Washington 30 years later. Things can move slowly.
And the feds and their indictments move slowly as well.
Yes. This will even probably be a slow trial. There's a lot of evidence to put on. The lawyers are going to be arguing back and forth constantly. This is going to take a few weeks.
Will his age matter?
Not in the sentencing much. As an effect, it's a terrible thing in terms of his personal life. He'll probably die in prison if he goes for any long stretch, which is a likely outcome.
Yeah, turning 80 at the end of the year.
Yep.
Why is this so significant?
After every major corruption trial, like the Blagojevich trial, we tend to get reforms passed. So what this and the Madigan convictions will do is fuel the next set of reforms to curb corruption.
Will they matter?
They will matter, yeah. They do narrow the opportunity for corruption.
Whether it's calls for more reform or whether we see different kind of politician. For instance, the person who now represents his ward, a very different Hispanic woman.
Yes. The city council today is very different from the city council I was in 1971.
And that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. We've moved away from the rubber stamp city council. There's now more blocks in the city council. They're articulating the goals of their constituents and their own ideology and their own conscience much better than the city council of the 1970s.
Wow. So the Ed Burke history, might be the final chapter is, who we'll see. But when the feds indict you, it's always very, very hard to come out ahead.
Well, he's already come out behind. He's already lost his position as finance chair. He lost his position as alderman. He lost his position as ward committeeman. So in any case, Ed Burke's political career is over. The best example is Tom Keene, who was a finance committee chair who went to prison. He never became important in the political party again.